Imagine a secret so profound, it could only be revealed by the dead. What if those who passed on held the key to the pack's ultimate fate? In this video, we're diving deep into the spectral whispers of the Omegas, exposing the devastating secrets they carried to their graves and forcing the living to confront the dark truths that shaped their destinies. The last recorded Omega death occurred on March 17, 1987. That's what the official record stated, at least. A single line in the pack registry, ink faded to near illegibility, marking the passing of Elias Morvan at the age of 42. Cause of death unspecified. Location unspecified. Witnesses none listed. After that entry, the pages dedicated to Omega births, deaths, and pack assignments simply stopped. Not torn out, not burned, not censored with heavy black lines, just stopped, as though the very concept of Omegas had been quietly erased from existence like morning mist beneath an unforgiving sun. For decades, no one spoke of it. Or rather, no one spoke of it loudly. In the shadowed corners of pack gatherings, after the third or fourth drink, older wolves might let slip a reference to the soft ones or the peacemakers, their voices dropping to barely audible murmurs before they caught themselves and changed the subject. The younger generations knew even less. Some believed Omegas to be nothing more than myth, a fabrication designed to explain away historical inconsistencies in pack structure. Others thought they might have been real, but were bred out of existence through natural selection, too weak to survive in an increasingly hostile world. But those who remembered, truly remembered, carried a different burden entirely. But before we dive in, I need to ask you something that truly matters to me. If you've enjoyed my stories before, or if you're here hoping this one will move you, please don't leave without subscribing. Without your subscription, YouTube buries everything I create. The people searching for stories that make them feel something, stories about resilience, love, impossible choices, they'll never find them. Because the algorithm decided I wasn't worth showing. I'm not asking for money. Just 30 seconds to hit that subscribe button so others can discover these stories too. I pour everything I have into every word, every character, every chapter. And knowing I could reach someone who desperately needs it but won't because you didn't click, that genuinely breaks my heart. Please subscribe. It costs you nothing, but to me, it means someone believes these stories matter. Now, let's continue. They recalled the Omegas as the invisible threads that held the pack together, the emotional ballast that prevented alphas from tearing each other apart during territorial disputes, the gentle voices that could soothe a feral wolf back to rationality. In the old hierarchy, Omegas occupied a paradoxical position, lowest in the formal power structure, yet absolutely essential to pack cohesion. They were protectors who needed protection, healers who bore everyone else's wounds, diplomats who possessed no official authority yet could halt conflicts with nothing more than their presence. They were vulnerable in ways that made even the most callous alpha uncomfortable. An Omega could be scent-marked by any pack member, could be ordered around by wolves far younger and less experienced, could be punished for the slightest perceived insubordination. Yet to harm an Omega, to truly, deliberately harm one, was considered the gravest taboo, an act that would see even the most powerful alpha exiled or executed. The pack protected what it could not afford to lose. Until, apparently, it lost them anyway. Dr. Quinkly Hillary had been the first to publicly question the disappearance, publishing a controversial paper in 2019 titled The Omega Erasure: Systematic Elimination or Mass Migration. Her academic career had been effectively destroyed within 6 months, research funding withdrawn, tenure revoked, her name becoming synonymous with conspiracy theorism and attention-seeking scholarship. The PAC's official position, delivered through carefully worded statements from the Council of Alphas, was that Omega genetics had simply become recessive, breeding themselves out over successive generations. A natural evolutionary adaptation, the statements read, to the changing demands of modern pack life. No one believed it. Not really. But it was easier to accept the lie than to ask the questions that followed. Where did they go? Why all at once? And most unsettling of all, what did we do to them? When the first whispers began in the winter of 2025, the skepticism was absolute. Strange occurrences were nothing new after all. Packs had always trafficked in the unexplained, territorial boundaries that animals refused to cross, ancient trees that bled sap the color of blood during the full moon, dens where compasses spun uselessly and electronics failed without explanation. The supernatural was woven into the fabric of pack existence so thoroughly that most wolves had learned to simply navigate around it without seeking deeper understanding. But this felt different. It started small. A beta in the Northern Territory woke one morning to find her grandmother's journals, lost in a house fire 15 years prior, stacked neatly on her kitchen table, their pages pristine despite their impossible return. An alpha in the coastal pack heard his name called in a voice he'd spent 30 years trying to forget, only to turn and find nothing but empty air and the lingering scent of lavender and rain, the signature scent of Marcus, the Omega he'd failed to protect during the Purge of '84. Individual incidents, easily dismissed. Then the dreams began. Wolves across 7 territories reported identical nightmares, standing in a vast, empty room with walls that seemed to breathe, where dozens of faces appeared in the surfaces like reflections in dark water. The faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed, mouths moving in silent speech. Some dreamers recognized the faces as Omegas they'd known personally. Others saw strangers wearing the distinctive silver bands that marked Omega status in the old days. All reported waking with the overwhelming sensation of being watched, judged, and found wanting. The pack leadership attempted to contain the situation through its usual methods: official denials, quiet intimidation of those who spoke too loudly, controlled information distribution through pack-approved channels. But the whispers had already spread too far, taken on too much momentum. Social media groups dedicated to Omega phenomena exploded in membership. Underground networks of researchers, many of them betas who'd grown up on stories of the vanished Omegas, began comparing notes and compiling evidence. And then came the Riverside incident. On February 3, 2026, 17 wolves from the Riverside pack simultaneously collapsed during a full moon gathering, convulsing and speaking in voices not their own. The episode lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, all 17 could recall nothing except the names they'd spoken, names that matched perfectly with Omegas who disappeared between 1983 and 1987. The skepticism began to crack. The Blackthorn archive had been sealed for 40 years. Located 3 levels beneath the primary pack headquarters in what had once been a Cold War-era bunker, the archive contained everything the Council of Alphas wanted forgotten: controversial tribunal transcripts, records of failed pack mergers, documentation of internal purges, and, most relevantly, the complete genealogical and personal records of every Omega born between 1923 and 1987. Dr. Marcus Webb had spent 6 months negotiating access, calling in every favor, leveraging every professional connection, and ultimately threatening to go public with leaked documents he may or may not have actually possessed. When the council finally, grudgingly granted him a single week of supervised access, he'd brought a team of 4, 2 historians, an archivist, and his sister Rachel, whose gifts as a medium had been carefully hidden from pack leadership her entire life. What they found shouldn't have been possible. The artifacts had rearranged themselves. "This makes no sense," muttered Dr. Lisa Tran, the senior archivist, staring at the rows of file boxes that had been meticulously organized by decade just days before during the preliminary catalog. These were in chronological order. "I supervised the arrangement myself." Now they were organized by something else entirely, a pattern that only became clear when Rachel walked the aisles with her eyes closed, fingers trailing along the cardboard edges. "They're grouped by manner of death," she whispered, and the temperature in the bunker seemed to drop 10 degrees. The first section, the largest, bore no external labels, but radiated a suffocating sense of violence. Files documenting Omegas who'd been killed, though the official records euphemistically termed them casualties of territorial disputes, or training accidents, or simply unspecified causes. Rachel's hands shook as she pulled out a folder at random. Sophia Delacroix, age 19, died April 2, 1984. The cause of death section had been blacked out with such force that the paper had torn. The second section felt different, cold, clinical, surgical. These files documented medical interventions and behavioral corrections, detailing procedures performed on Omegas who'd been deemed unstable or maladaptive to pack hierarchy. Rachel opened one file and immediately slammed it shut, her face draining of color. "What?" Marcus moved to her side. "What did you see?" "Sterilizations," Rachel managed, her voice barely audible. "Forced sterilizations. Dozens of them. They were, oh God, Marcus, some of them were children. 12, 13 years old." The third section was smallest, but somehow worst. A neat row of files marked with a single red dot. When Marcus opened the first, he found himself reading a transfer order dated March 15, 1987, 2 days before the last official Omega death. The document authorized the relocation of 43 Omegas to an off-site facility for enhanced integration protocols. No return date was listed. No facility location was specified. No follow-up documentation existed. It was Rachel who felt them first, a presence pressing against the edges of perception, like someone standing just outside your field of vision, waiting for you to turn your head. The air grew heavy with the scent of rain and lavender and something else, something chemical and wrong that made her wolf recoil in instinctive horror. "We're not alone," she said. The lights flickered. All of them at once, throughout the entire bunker, a synchronized strobe that shouldn't have been possible given the independent power systems. In the stuttering illumination, Marcus could have sworn he saw figures standing between the filing cabinets, translucent, wavering, their outlines sharp enough to be distinct, but never quite solid enough to be real. Then the voices started. Not audible exactly. More like memories of voices, impressions of speech that bypassed the ears entirely and manifested directly in the mind. Rachel gasped and pressed her hands to her temples, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of communication. The others felt it too, though less intensely, a pressure building behind their eyes, a sensation of words trying to form themselves from the static of their own thoughts. Rachel's gifts as a medium had always been subtle, easily rationalized. She'd see a flash of the recently deceased at funerals, sometimes receive vague impressions of what someone's dead relative might have wanted to say. Useful for bringing peace to grieving families, but hardly the dramatic seances of popular imagination. This was something entirely different. The dead Omegas weren't politely waiting their turn to communicate. They were screaming. Not in pain, or not only in pain. They were screaming warnings, accusations, confessions, all of it pouring through Rachel's consciousness in a torrent that threatened to sweep her away entirely. Marcus caught her as her knees buckled, lowering her carefully to the concrete floor while Dr. Tran scrambled for the emergency medical kit. "Rachel, stay with me. What are they saying? Can you understand them?" Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites. When she spoke, her voice was layered, as though a dozen people were using her vocal cords simultaneously. "Betrayed. We were betrayed. The pact was broken. The protection was a lie. They promised safety and delivered us to—" The voice cut off with a choking sound. Rachel convulsed once, violently, then went limp in Marcus's arms. The lights stabilized. The presence withdrew, not disappearing but retreating to a watchful distance, like predators circling just outside the firelight. When Rachel regained consciousness 20 minutes later, she could barely speak above a whisper, her throat raw as though she'd been screaming for hours. But she could write, and what she wrote in her shaking hand would change everything. They didn't die. They were taken. Over the following 3 days, Marcus's team developed a protocol, dangerous, exhausting, but effective. They would select specific artifacts, objects that had belonged to individual Omegas, and Rachel would serve as a conduit, allowing the attached presence to communicate through her for brief, carefully controlled intervals. Between sessions, she required hours of rest and consumed alarming quantities of food and water, the spiritual communication apparently burning through her physical resources at an unsustainable rate. But the messages came through. The first coherent communication came from an Omega named Thomas Ashford, speaking through a silver pocket watch that had been catalogued among his personal effects. His message was brief, delivered in Rachel's voice, but with cadences and phrasings that were distinctly not hers. "They told us we were going somewhere safe. A sanctuary, they called it, where we'd be protected from the violence of the territory wars. We believed them. We wanted to believe them. We were so tired of being caught in the middle, of absorbing everyone else's rage and fear and aggression until we could barely remember who we were underneath all that borrowed emotion." The watch grew cold in Rachel's hand, frost forming along its edge despite the bunker's climate-controlled environment. The facility was underground. No windows. They said it was for our safety, that the isolation would help us develop our gifts without the interference of pack politics. For the first week, it almost seemed true. Then the tests began. Rachel's face contorted with pain she wasn't experiencing herself, her free hand clawing at her arm hard enough to leave marks. They wanted to know what made us different. What made us Omega. They took blood, tissue samples, spinal fluid. They measured our hormone levels during induced rage states, pumped us full of alpha pheromones to see what would happen, observed how long we could maintain stability when exposed to concentrated pack violence. The temperature continued to drop. Marcus could see his breath now. Some of us broke. Lost our minds entirely, went feral in ways that Omegas aren't supposed to be capable of. Those ones disappeared. We never saw them again. The rest of us, we learned to hide what was happening to us. We smiled when they wanted us to smile. We submitted when submission was expected. And we waited. Waited for what? Marcus asked softly. Rachel's eyes snapped open, but they weren't hers. The irises had lightened to an unnatural silver, reflecting light like a cat's in darkness. For them to make a mistake. For someone outside to notice we were gone. For the pack to come looking for us. A sound halfway between a laugh and a sob forced its way out of Rachel's throat. No one came. 43 of us went into that facility. After 3 years, 6 of us were still alive. And when they were done with their experiments, when they'd extracted everything they wanted to learn, they didn't release us. They couldn't risk us talking about what had been done. So they made sure we never would. The watch shattered in Rachel's hand, tiny gears and fragments of crystal scattering across the concrete. She collapsed again, this time remaining unconscious for 6 hours. The name came through on the 4th day, Councilman Alexander Thorne. Even whispered by a dead Omega through an exhausted medium, the name carried weight. Thorne was pack royalty, descended from a line of alphas that stretched back to the founding of the North American pack system. He'd served on the council for 37 years, survived 4 leadership challenges, and was currently positioned as the leading candidate for High Alpha when the current leader stepped down. He was also, according to multiple Omega witnesses, the architect of their destruction. The evidence came in pieces, fragments of memory and spectral testimony that Marcus's team had to carefully reconstruct like archaeologists assembling a shattered artifact. Each communication session with the dead yielded new details, new connections, new horrors. It was an Omega named Jennifer Sakamoto who first identified Thorne directly, speaking through a blood-stained medical bracelet that had been among her cataloged belongings. He visited the facility twice. The first time was during the initial month, when they were still pretending this was about our safety. He walked through the dormitories with the head researcher, discussing us like we were livestock. I heard him say, "The pack can't afford the liability anymore. Too unpredictable, too much risk. Better to understand what makes them function, then breed it out or learn to replicate it artificially." Rachel, serving as conduit, shuddered violently. The second visit was after the experiments had turned brutal. He came to observe directly. They had Maria Cortez restrained in the testing chamber. She was 17, the youngest of us, and they were flooding the room with chemically synthesized rage pheromones at concentrations that would have driven an alpha to murder. We could hear her screaming from 3 corridors away. Tears streamed down Rachel's face, though her expression remained eerily blank. Thorne watched through the observation window for 47 minutes. He took notes. When Maria finally broke, when her mind shattered and she started attacking herself, he nodded to the researcher and said, "Fascinating." The self-preservation instinct subordinates entirely to the need to prevent harm to others, even imaginary others. Exactly as hypothesized. The medical bracelet began to smoke in Rachel's grip, the metal heating to temperatures that should have burned her skin. She didn't seem to notice. Maria died 3 days later. They told us it was a stroke. But I saw her body when they removed it. I saw the marks on her throat where she'd clawed out her own windpipe trying to stop herself from screaming, trying not to disturb the others her broken mind believed she was protecting. The bracelet melted, silver alloy dripping between Rachel's fingers like tears. But Thorne wasn't working alone. As more Omegas came forward, some speaking through objects, others manifesting as brief visual phenomena that pack researchers captured on film, still others communicating through shared dreams that left recipients gasping and disturbed. A broader conspiracy emerged. Names accumulated. Dr. Evelyn Cross, the behavioral scientist who designed the integration protocols. General Marcus Stone, who'd provided military resources and personnel to operate the facility. Stella Voss, the council secretary who'd falsified records and redirected inquiries from concerned PAC members looking for missing Omegas. Each betrayal worse than the last. Dr. Cross had published 17 papers between 1985 and 1990, groundbreaking research into PAC hierarchy and neurochemical bonding mechanisms. The papers had revolutionized modern understanding of PAC dynamics and were still cited in current academic literature. None of them disclosed that the data had come from tortured Omegas who'd never consented to participate in research. General Stone had used the facility to test combat applications of Omega abilities, attempting to weaponize their capacity for emotional regulation. The experiments involved exposing Omegas to captured enemy combatants in various states of induced rage, measuring how long the Omega could maintain control, documenting what happened when that control failed. 17 Omegas died during these trials. Stone received a commendation for innovative approaches to hostile engagement protocols. Stella Voss had been the most personally devastating betrayal because she herself had been born to an Omega parent. Her mother had died when Stella was 12, officially from pneumonia, but whispers suggested something darker, and Stella had spent her career systematically erasing evidence that Omegas had ever existed, replacing them in official histories with sanitized references to PAC support specialists and hierarchical facilitators. The dead Omegas saved their most damning revelations for her. Through a battered notebook that had belonged to an Omega named Hilary Paul, the message came through Rachel with cold precision. Stella knew where we were. Families contacted her, desperate for information about missing loved ones. She told them the Omegas had chosen to leave, had requested isolation to develop their gifts without PAC interference. She showed them forged letters in our handwriting, explained that we were happy and safe and simply needed space. Rachel's hand moved across her own notebook without conscious direction, channeling David's words directly. My sister May came to PAC headquarters 7 times. 7 times she demanded to speak with me, to at least confirm I was alive and making these choices willingly. Stella turned her away each time. Eventually, May gave up. She died believing I'd abandoned her, that I'd chosen strangers over family. The channeling broke, and Rachel sobbed openly, grieving for strangers she'd never known, carrying their pain like it was her own. Marcus's team began cross-referencing the spectral accusations with physical evidence, digging through the archive for documentation that would corroborate the claims. What they found was damning in its absence, gaps in the records that perfectly aligned with Omega testimony, missing files that should have existed, transfer orders that led nowhere. But absence of evidence wasn't enough. Not when accusing people as powerful as Councilman Thorne. Then they found the recordings. Buried in a misfiled box labeled Territory Mapping 1986 to 1987, hidden beneath genuine survey maps, they discovered 7 cassette tapes. The labels had been deliberately obscured, black marker covering whatever had originally been written, but the tapes themselves were intact. Dr. Tran set up the ancient playback equipment with hands that trembled slightly. The first tape contained a conversation dated March 3, 1987, 2 weeks before the last official Omega death. Councilman Thorne's voice was unmistakable, that distinctive aristocratic cadence that made even casual conversation sound like a formal address. The question isn't whether we can do it, Evelyn. The question is whether we're prepared to live with the consequences. Stella Voss's response was equally clear. The consequences of keeping them are worse, Alexander. You've seen the projections. In 20 years, 30 at most, pack structure as we know it collapses. Alphas can't maintain dominance when there are omegas constantly undermining the hierarchy by making everyone feel better about submission. We need clear lines of power. And the families? The pack members will notice their absence. A pause. Then, people forget what they're encouraged to forget. We control the narrative. We always have. The recording continued for 37 minutes, a calm, rational discussion of genocide disguised as policy planning. The second tape was worse. It contained audio from inside the facility, screams, pleading, the clinical voices of researchers documenting reactions. At one point, a voice Marcus didn't recognize asked, Subject 7 has requested to speak with family. Do we allow contact? Absolutely not, came Dr. Cross's response. Emotional attachment to outside pack structures interferes with baseline measurements. Maintain isolation protocols. Subject 7 is threatening self-harm if we don't. Increased monitoring, physical restraints if necessary. Note the behavioral shift in the records. This confirms Hypothesis 3 regarding omega stress responses. The team listened to all 7 tapes in mounting horror. Each one provided clear evidence of premeditation, of systematic planning, of casual cruelty delivered in the measured tones of bureaucratic efficiency. By the time the final tape ended, a conversation about disposal protocols for subjects who'd outlived their research utility, even Marcus's professional detachment had crumbled. We have to make this public, he said, his voice rough. All of it. The recordings, the testimony, everything. Rachel, still pale and shaking from the last channeling session, shook her head. You know what will happen. Thorne and the others will claim the tapes are fabricated, that the Omega testimony is unprovable spirit communication, that we're conspiracy theorists trying to destabilize pack leadership. Then we make the evidence so overwhelming they can't dismiss it. We find survivors. Marcus. Rachel's eyes met his, and he saw the terrible truth reflected there. I've been in contact with 43 different Omegas. None of them survived the facility. The ones speaking to us now, they're speaking because they're dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Dr. Tran spoke up. Not all of them died in the facility. The records show 6 were released. Where are they? It was the right question, but finding the answer would prove more horrifying than anyone anticipated. The 6 released Omegas had been scattered across the country, their identities legally altered, their histories erased. It took Marcus's team 3 weeks and the assistance of several underground beta networks to locate the first one. Her name had been Catherine Wells. Now she went by Catherine Wright, lived in a small town 2,000 miles from any major pack territory, and worked as a librarian at an elementary school. She looked 20 years older than her actual age of 53, her hair completely white, hands trembling with a palsy that suggested neurological damage. She refused to speak to Marcus on the phone, refused to answer emails, sent back every letter unopened. It was only when Rachel showed up at her door alone, without cameras or recording equipment, that Catherine finally let someone in. I knew you'd come eventually, Catherine said, her voice carrying the brittle quality of something that had broken and been poorly mended. "I've felt them gathering. The dead ones. They're angry. They want justice," Rachel said softly. "Justice." Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They want revenge. There's a difference." Rachel settled into the worn armchair Catherine indicated, noting the protective wards drawn in salt along the windowsills, the iron bars reinforcing the door, the deliberate absence of silver anywhere in the small apartment. "What did they do to you?" Rachel asked. "After the facility?" Catherine was silent for a long moment, staring at her shaking hands. When she finally spoke, the words came slowly, as if each one had to be carefully excavated from some deep, dark place. "They couldn't kill us. The 6 who survived, I mean. We'd lasted too long, endured too much. If we died immediately after release, it would have raised questions. So they did something worse." She stood, moving to a locked cabinet that held a single file folder. Inside were medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and a legal document that made Rachel's blood run cold. "They broke us deliberately," Catherine continued. "Systematically destroyed our ability to function in pack society. Then they had us declared mentally incompetent and severed our pack bonds legally. As far as official records show, we ceased to be pack members in 1990. We became nothing. Humans with wolf ancestry, but no legal status within pack hierarchy. But why? If you were already silenced. Because we weren't just research subjects." Catherine's voice hardened. "We were proof of concept. Everything they learned from us, all those experiments, all that data, it was never about understanding omegas. It was about eliminating the need for them entirely." She pulled out a second folder, this one containing scientific papers and patent applications. "Dr. Cross developed synthetic bonding hormones based on our neurochemistry. They're used now in every major pack territory to enhance cohesion and facilitate hierarchy integration. General Stone's combat protocols are standard training for pack enforcers. Stella Vassa's archival methodologies, her techniques for optimizing historical records, are taught in pack administration courses." Rachel felt sick. "They built an empire on your suffering. More than that, they built a world where omegas would never be needed again. Why deal with the complications of a subordinate class that could actually influence alpha behavior, that could disrupt power structures just by existing, when you could synthesize the useful parts and discard the inconvenient humanity?" Catherine returned to her seat, and Rachel could see the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. The hidden agenda wasn't just about removing omegas from the current pack structure. It was about ensuring they could never return. By the time they released us, they'd already begun the genetic screening programs. Any wolf showing omega markers was identified young and pressured into sterilization or voluntary mate selection with partners likely to produce alpha or beta offspring. That's eugenics. Yes. Catherine's smile was bitter. But nobody calls it that. They call it optimizing genetic diversity or enhancing pack viability. The language is different, but the goal is the same: eliminate omega genetics from the wolf population entirely within 3 generations. Rachel's mind raced, connecting pieces she'd been too close to see clearly. The fertility crisis. The declining pack populations. Everyone blames environmental factors, but removing omegas destabilized the entire system, Catherine finished. We weren't just emotional support or social glue. We were regulators. Without omegas, alpha aggression escalates unchecked, Beta stress responses become pathological, pack cohesion deteriorates. The synthetic hormones help, but they're not a replacement. They're a band-aid on a severed artery. She leaned forward, her pale eyes intense. And the people who did this to us, they knew. The research data was clear. Dr. Cross's own notes, buried in the classified sections of her work, explicitly state that removing omegas would likely lead to population decline and increased interpack violence. They knew, and they did it anyway, because maintaining rigid power structures was more important than pack survival. Rachel thought of Councilman Thorne, still poised to become High Alpha. Of Stella Voss, recently promoted to Senior Council Advisor. Of Dr. Cross, who'd received the Pack Achievement Award just 3 years ago for her groundbreaking contributions to behavioral science. They're still in power, she said numbly. All of them. They destroyed an entire designation, destabilized the species, and they're being rewarded for it. Of course they are. Catherine stood, moving to the window, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light. Because the pack structure they created serves them perfectly. High alphas with unquestioned authority, enforced through synthetic bonding chemistry rather than genuine social connection. Betas who've been taught that their discomfort with the system is individual weakness rather than a response to an unnatural hierarchy. And no omegas to remind anyone that it wasn't always like this. She turned back to Rachel. That's the real hidden agenda. Not just genocide, but historical revision. They're creating a world where wolves believe this is how things are supposed to be, where the current power structure feels natural and inevitable rather than manufactured and maintained through deliberate violence. Rachel stayed with Catherine for 3 more hours, recording testimony that would corroborate everything the dead Omegas had revealed. When she finally left, Catherine walked her to the door and pressed something into her hand, a small silver pendant in the shape of an Omega symbol. This belonged to Hilary Paul, Catherine said. He gave it to me the night before they separated us. He said if he didn't survive, someone should remember he existed. That we all existed. Rachel closed her fingers around the pendant. The world is going to remember. I promise you that. Good. Catherine's expression was unreadable. But be careful. The people you're going up against, they've already committed 1 genocide to protect their power. They won't hesitate to do it again. The warning proved prophetic. Marcus received the first death threat 2 days after Rachel returned with Catherine's testimony. A message left on his office voicemail, digitally altered to disguise the voice. Stop digging, or you'll end up in a deeper hole than you can climb out of. Dr. Tran's car was vandalized, a crude Omega symbol spray-painted across the windshield with the word traitor underneath. Rachel's apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, a clear message that they could reach her whenever they wanted. The team reported everything to Pack authorities. The investigations went nowhere. Meanwhile, Marcus's research revealed more disturbing patterns. The facility where the Omegas had been held wasn't the only one. There had been 3 others, operating between 1983 and 1995, each focused on different aspects of Omega integration research. Combined, they'd processed over 200 Omegas. The survival rate across all facilities was 8%. And the applications of the research extended far beyond pack management. Pharmaceutical companies had licensed the bonding hormone technology, marketing it to humans as a treatment for social anxiety and attachment disorders. Military contractors had acquired the emotional regulation protocols, using them to design psychological conditioning programs. Tech companies were developing apps based on the Omega empathy mapping research, promising users enhanced emotional intelligence through AI-driven feedback systems. The pack leadership hadn't just committed genocide. They'd commercialized it, profiting from the murder of their own people while ensuring the victims would be forgotten entirely. Rachel read through the financial records Marcus had uncovered, her hands shaking with rage. Councilman Thorne owns 17% of Synthbond Pharmaceuticals. Stella Voss sits on the board of Harmony Tech. Dr. Cross receives consulting fees from 4 different companies, all using research derived from the facilities. They're not just covering up their crimes, Marcus said grimly. They're building their legacies on them. The dead Omegas, watching through the veil, grew increasingly agitated. Rachel could feel their presence constantly now, a cold pressure at the back of her mind that never fully dissipated. They weren't just seeking acknowledgement anymore. They were demanding action, and they were willing to take it into their own hands. The first manifestation occurred during a council session on April 15, 2025. Councilman Thorne was presenting the quarterly territory report when the temperature in the chamber dropped 30 degrees in the span of 3 seconds. His breath misted in the air as he spoke, words trailing off mid-sentence as frost began creeping across the polished oak table. Then the whispers started. Not audible whispers, these bypass sound entirely, planting themselves directly in the minds of everyone present. 43 voices speaking in terrible unison, naming their names, reciting their deaths, identifying their murderers. Thomas Ashford, deceased March 29, 1987, cardiac arrest induced by experimental fear conditioning overseen by Alexander Thorne. Jennifer Sakamoto, deceased June 14, 1987, cerebral hemorrhage following exposure to synthetic rage compounds administered by Dr. Evelyn Cross. Hilary Paul, deceased September 2, 1987, suicide after being informed his family had been told he was dead, information provided by Stella Voss. On and on, a litany of the dead that lasted 17 minutes while the council sat frozen, unable to move or speak or escape. Several members later reported feeling hands on their shoulders, cold fingers wrapped around their throats, the sensation of being held underwater while the accusations poured through their minds. When it ended, Councilman Thorne collapsed. The official report stated he'd suffered a minor stroke brought on by stress. Unofficially, those present whispered that he'd aged 20 years in those 17 minutes, his hair going completely white, deep lines carving themselves into his face as though decades of guilt had manifested physically all at once. The incident couldn't be suppressed. Too many witnesses, too many council members whose loyalty was questionable, too many smartphone videos of the aftermath showing Thorne being carried out on a stretcher, murmuring apologies to people who weren't there. The media eruption was immediate and catastrophic. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about the vanished Omegas. News outlets that had dismissed the story as conspiracy theory weeks earlier now dedicated entire segments to investigating the claims. PAC members who'd lost Omega relatives decades ago came forward with their own testimonies, describing how they'd been stonewalled and dismissed and intimidated into silence. Marcus's research was leaked. He never discovered who did it, though he suspected someone on the council with their own agenda and spread across the internet like wildfire. The recordings, the testimony, the financial connections, all of it laid bare for public consumption. Within 72 hours, 3 major PAC territories had called for Thorne's resignation. Dr. Cross issued a statement denying all allegations and promptly fled the country. Stella Voss attempted to hold a press conference explaining her actions as difficult but necessary decisions made in service to pack stability, and was shouted down by protesters who'd surrounded the building. The High Alpha, finally forced to respond to the crisis, announced the formation of an independent investigation committee. The announcement satisfied no one, because the dead Omegas weren't finished. Rachel felt them gathering, a storm of spectral rage that she had no way to contain. They'd tried patience. They'd tried working through proper channels, providing evidence, following the rules of a system that had murdered them. Now they were done with patience. The second manifestation hit the Synthbond Pharmaceuticals headquarters during their annual shareholder meeting. Every person in the building simultaneously experienced a vision, not a suggestion or impression, but a full sensory immersion in the memories of Omega test subjects. They felt the restraints cutting into their wrists, the chemical burn of experimental compounds in their bloodstream, the soul-crushing isolation of months without pack contact. The particular horror of being told by smiling researchers that their pain was contributing to the greater good. The visions lasted for minutes. When they ended, 18 people required hospitalization for psychological trauma. The company's stock price crashed by 43%, 1% for each dead Omega, and never recovered. Then Harmony Tech, then the consulting firm that employed Dr. Cross's associates, then the military contractor that had purchased General Stone's protocols. One by one, the institutions built on Omega suffering found themselves under spectral assault, their employees haunted by the memories of victims, their operations disrupted by phenomena that no amount of technology could explain or prevent. The pack leadership attempted to frame it as mass hysteria, as coordinated hoaxes, as anything except what it actually was. But too many people had experienced it directly. Too many witnesses had felt those cold hands, heard those accusing whispers, lived through memories that weren't their own. The truth was unavoidable. The dead were speaking, and they would not be silenced again. Rachel, exhausted from serving as an unwilling conduit, finally confronted the Omega presences directly. She went to the Blackthorn archive alone, surrounded herself with the artifacts and records of the dead, and opened her mind fully to their communication. "What do you want?" she asked the cold air. "You've exposed them. The world knows what happened. What more do you need?" The response came not in words, but in a flood of emotion so intense it drove her to her knees. Rage and grief and bitter vindication, yes, but underneath it all, a profound, aching loneliness. They were dead, cut off from the pack bonds that had defined their existence, isolated in death as they had been in their final years of life. They didn't want revenge, Rachel realized. Or rather, they wanted it, but it wouldn't satisfy the deeper hunger. They wanted to come home. But how do you give rest to the dead when the pack that killed them still stands? When the people who murdered them walk free, wealthy, and powerful, and protected by systems designed to shield them from consequence? The question consumed Rachel, and, through her, it consumed the team, the investigators, the growing movement of pack members demanding justice for the vanished Omegas. The answer came from an unexpected source, the Omega offspring. They'd been hidden for decades, these children and grandchildren of Omegas who'd survived long enough to reproduce before the final purge. Many hadn't known their heritage. The Omega designation had been deliberately scrubbed from family records, the distinctive genetic markers dismissed as anomalies. But the recent revelations had prompted genetic testing, genealogical research, a desperate search for connection to the murdered dead. Thousands came forward, claiming Omega ancestry. Not all the claims were legitimate, but enough were to constitute a significant population. They organized quickly, forming coalitions and advocacy groups, demanding recognition of Omega designation as a protected status, calling for reparations and systemic reform. More importantly, they demanded the right to mourn their dead. The memorial gathering was held on June 1, 2025, in the Central Pac Territory. 43,000 people attended, 1,000 for each murdered Omega. They filled the ceremonial grounds to capacity and spilled out into the surrounding areas, a sea of wolves wearing silver bands in honor of the dead. Rachel stood at the center, still serving as a conduit, but this time channeling something different than accusation. The Omega presences flowed through her, speaking to their descendants, their former pack mates, the people who remembered them. "We forgive you," the voices said through her, and the shock of it rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Not them, never them. The ones who killed us, who profited from our deaths, who built their empire on our suffering, they will answer for what they've done, in this world or the next. But you, the ones who didn't know, who couldn't have stopped it, who mourned us in silence, you we forgive. Rachel could feel the spectral presences beginning to loosen their grip on the physical world, their rage finally finding an outlet in this mass acknowledgement of their existence, their suffering, their stolen lives. "We existed," the voices continued. "We mattered. We were not perfect, not powerless, not the myths they made of us afterward. We were Pac, and we were murdered, and now you know. Remember us. Not as victims, not as symbols, but as people who loved and hoped and died terrified and alone. Remember us and do better." The manifestation that followed was different from the others. Instead of cold and accusation, there was warmth, a sensation like being embraced by someone you'd thought lost forever. 43,000 people experienced it simultaneously, the feeling of being welcomed back, of being told, "You are Pac, you are home, you are remembered." When it faded, the oppressive presence that had haunted Rachel for months was gone. Not entirely. She could still feel the Omega dead, still sense their watchful attention, but the desperate, clawing urgency had dissipated. They had been acknowledged. They had come home in the only way the dead could. Rachel collapsed, and this time when she woke, the voices were quiet. But the reckoning was just beginning. Councilman Thorne was formally indicted 3 weeks later, along with Dr. Cross, Stella Voss, General Stone, and 17 others. The trials would take years, complicated by the unusual nature of the evidence, the powerful interests defending the accused, the fundamental questions about how a pack society prosecutes its own leadership for crimes committed under the color of authority. The synthetic bonding hormone industry faced mass lawsuits from users who'd never been informed of the compound's origins. Several companies declared bankruptcy, others rebranded desperately, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. The pack's fertility crisis deepened as more wolves questioned the systems they'd been taught to accept without examination. Birth rates dropped to historic lows as potential parents refused to bring children into a hierarchy they no longer trusted. And the Omega descendants organized, demanding not just recognition but restoration, the legal right to identify as Omega, the protection of Omega genetics, the acknowledgement that the pack hierarchy as currently constituted was built on genocide and could not continue unchanged. Marcus Webb, watching the chaos unfold from his university office, wondered if they'd done the right thing. Yes, they'd exposed the truth. Yes, they'd given the dead Omegas a voice. But they'd also destabilized everything, torn down systems without yet having built anything to replace them. Rachel, when he voiced these doubts, fixed him with a look that reminded him uncomfortably of the dead Omegas she'd channeled. The old system was built on murder, she said quietly. It needed to be torn down. What comes next, that's up to the living. But at least now we're building on truth instead of lies. She still wore Hilary Paul's Omega pendant, the silver catching the light. The dead told us what happened. They showed us who we'd become when we allowed power to matter more than people. Now we have to decide what to do with that knowledge. Do we rebuild the same hierarchy with better PR? Or do we imagine something different entirely? It was the question that would define the next generation of pack society. There were no easy answers, no clear paths forward. But for the first time in 40 years, the conversation about Omegas was happening openly. Their names were being spoken. Their deaths were being mourned. Their legacy, both the beauty of what they'd been and the horror of what had been done to them, was being acknowledged. The dead Omegas had achieved what they set out to do. They had made themselves impossible to forget. And in the pack territories, in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, some wolves reported still feeling that spectral presence, not threatening, not accusing, but watching. Waiting to see what the living would do with the truth they'd fought so hard to reveal. The whispers from beyond had delivered their message. Now it was up to the pack to decide whether they would listen. 1 year after the memorial gathering, Catherine Wells died peacefully in her sleep. She was 54 years old. At her funeral, attended by hundreds of Omega descendants and advocates, Rachel served as a medium one final time. The message Catherine left was brief. I can feel them now. My packmates, the ones who didn't survive. They're here, and they're whole, and they're free. Tell the living, your suffering matters. Your truth matters. Don't let anyone silence you ever again. Rachel placed Hilary Paul's Omega pendant in Catherine's casket, finally returning it to someone who had known him, loved him, survived when he could not. The investigations continued. The trials proceeded. The pack fractured and reformed and struggled toward something new. And in the Blackthorn archive, on quiet nights when no one was present, the artifacts still rearranged themselves sometimes, not in patterns of death anymore, but in patterns of remembrance. 43 names, never to be forgotten again.